So Donald Trump and the United States military operation against Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro has left the international system reeling, many questioning all the principles and norms we have perhaps taken for granted, not just merely a rejection, but an exposure of whether international law really ever existed, and a return firmly to the ideas of realpolitik, regional spheres, spheres of influence, and great power politics. For many smaller states wondering whether they might be next, not merely from threats or sanctions, but the forcible removal. But yet, it goes further than that, and in ways you might not have considered. Countries all reacting to whether they could be impacted, including some of the largest shockwaves landing somewhere you wouldn't think of. Moscow, Vladimir Putin, Russia. Because what happened in Venezuela isn't really about just Latin America. It's about how power is used again, openly, unapologetically, and what it means for countries like Russia that have built their entire legitimacy around the idea of strength, hard power, and coercion. In this video, I wanted to break down what has happened, how Russians themselves view it, and why it is so psychologically devastating for Putin. It demonstrates something very clear, that Russia has claimed to do something, but the United States actually did it. And whether or not Russia can go toe-to-toe in a way that Putin has always claimed, but now he might have to actually follow through on his words. Let's get into this one. There's a lot here you might not have considered.
This is the Global Gambit.
How are you going, everyone? Welcome to the channel where I provide you an insider's perspective on power and strategy, which in this focus is of course about the impacts of Operation Absolute Resolve on Russia, the hard interests and realities that the Kremlin is facing. Before getting into it, of course, I'm very curious how you see this. There's a lot going on, of course, always over the Russia-Ukraine war, but the dynamics, the global repercussions of what happened on Friday night are apparent, must be taken into consideration when we look at Russia and how Putin will be approaching his strategic decision-making for 2026. Now, on the face of it, Russia is probably not the first country you think of when it comes to the implications of Trump's actions in Venezuela. But you have to understand why this landed so hard in Moscow. You must therefore separate symbolism from substance and start with how the Russians themselves have read this specific operation. Now, crucially, Russian reactions were immediate, emotional, but also unusually honest. Some of the most public commentators that we can find, be it on Telegram or Russian state TV, were very simple, recognizing the brutal precision, speed, efficiency of the operation. Trump carrying out what they called a special Venezuelan operation, which lasted, at least in what's known as its active phase of actually acquiring Maduro, 30 minutes. The whole operation, 90? Less than 3 hours. But the joke being, of course, the United States conducted in 3 hours what the Russians were supposed to do in 3 days. Putin rapidly taking notes there. Now that phase and phrase alone cuts deep, because for 4 years, Putin has wrapped his entire leadership, legitimacy around this SMO in Ukraine. A campaign that was sold as fast, decisive, controlled, but also legitimate. Instead, of course, we know what it is. A grinding war of attrition, improvisation, lowered expectations, and inconceivable human loss. The US operation has delivered the comparison the Kremlin has likely feared the most. The swift, decisive intervention with no visible losses. The stark contrast between the United States military and the Russians. Telegram channels were oozing with rage and envy. Not outrage, just pure envy. The Americans have done in minutes what the Russians couldn't do in years. And that comparison doesn't just undermine the war, it undermines, as I say, Putin personally. And for someone who runs his entire system in an even more centralized and sort of extreme version of Maduro's, it's the worst possible thing he can have right now. This is where the Kremlin's discomfort also stops being abstract and becomes visible. In its own words, this isn't any fringe commentary. One particular example I saw stand out came from Margarita Simonia, one of the regime's most prominent propagandists. She simply wrote 2 words in Russian: "We are jealous." Which, well, that's not a case of poor messaging discipline. It's just a blunt admission. Even drunken former President Dmitry Medvedev jumped to the nuclear rhetoric, although which he does often, declaring that only nuclear weapons can now guarantee Russia's safety. And indeed, that escalation, of course, tells you something crucial. That when a state reaches for its nuclear signaling this quickly, it's because conventional credibility, its kinetic conventional military, looks very thin, and why China is rapidly increasing its own stockpiles, because it feels it needs that as a reflective deterrence as well. Other commentary I saw was even more blunt, that the implications running through was Putin was morally compromised now. He's operationally incompetent, and we know just how much the military leadership, the security services try to sort of paint a better picture than the realities for Putin so that he can, well, they don't end up suddenly on the other side of a window. It's therefore a far more dangerous conclusion for a regime that is supposed to be built on this strength, their ability to project power and a counterbalance of force against that of the United States, let alone with or without its alliance network. Indeed, this isn't just a reputation for Putin. It carries three concrete costs: geopolitical, economic, but also more specifically coercive. Now, it's easy to dismiss Venezuela as peripheral, and indeed in some ways it is. Latin America is often seen in geopolitics as a bit of a forgotten about subcontinent. But for Russia, it is absolutely integral to this broader grand strategy counterbalancing approach. Venezuela was simply Moscow's most important foothold in Latin America, a geopolitical anchor supporting Cuba, Nicaragua, and Russia's claim to have this global reach beyond its immediate neighborhood, traditional sphere of influence. Venezuela is more important than Cuba because its economy was still somewhat functional. Even though the Cubans have that historical relationship, it was Venezuela where Russia was able to launch military operations and just have a military footprint. That entire notion completely evaporated now. And the pressure doesn't stop with Russia. Of course it doesn't. Friendly and nominally neutral states, you could argue, such as, say, Colombia or Brazil, will now have to feel a much more considerative approach, pressure to fall in line under the US. And we could see what Trump is saying about Colombia and its leadership, given they're not willing to do that. Traditional US adversaries like Cuba and Nicaragua, though, suddenly face a far more precarious future if they lose access to any form of support that continues to exist. In the case of Venezuela, the actual physical lifeline of oil supply that was given, propping up Cuba's entire economy, and that you can find in another video on the channel. More specifically, though, there is real money here involved, and not just for Moscow, of course. The potential loss of access to Venezuelan energy is going to hurt not just Moscow, but of course its bigger partner, China. Russian companies hold significant stakes in Venezuela's economy through joint ventures in what's known as the Orinoco Belt, while China is the country's single largest creditor, with Trump basically saying Marco Rubio administers the country. Well, Russia and China have to play a very different game. They are no longer able to command being principal energy partners in Venezuela's energy infrastructure. Their ambitions in the broader Americas, especially China's economics perspective, let alone Russia's military one, are completely in disarray. Russia's energy companies have roughly 18 billion tied up in Venezuelan oil and gas projects, and so those investments are either now frozen, lost, or exposed to unprecedented US leverage. And this comes after Russia has already lost, of course, Syria last year as a reliable zone for not just capital investment, but geostrategic presence. Venezuela was the fallback, but now it's gone too. Russia really has to consider where it's going to put its remaining eggs, which basket is the one least fraying. Aside of all of this, there's another truly sensitive risk: testimony. Maduro knows a great deal about sanctions evasion, grey financial schemes, arms trafficking, money laundering networks, all of which rely on or have been involved with heavily Russian actors. So if Maduro talks, the consequences for Russia could be off the scale. And so it's why some Russian onlookers are treating this as not just a sideshow, but a geopolitical, a geoeconomic, a geostrategic defeat. Russia really, or specifically the Kremlin, has to be incredibly careful about how it manages the fallout going forward. Otherwise, its shadow fleet, so many things it's leveraging now, especially in the context of Ukraine, will be even more exposed. And then, aside from the external shocks, we have to shift to the internal threats. The most destabilizing may not be external at all, interestingly. Venezuela joins this growing list from Armenia, Iran, Syria, where Moscow has talked big but delivered absolutely nothing. The lesson that Russian elites are learning, let alone the countries in question, are that if things turn worse, protection is just not guaranteed, it's probably non-existent. That breeds paranoia, demonstrative loyalty, mutual suspicion, and as I've made in another video a few weeks back, Russians' elites are actually hedging against their own economy and leadership through gold. There's of course the unspoken conclusion sitting beneath all of this. If it ever comes to that, then no one will ever stand up for Putin. That's what really scares them, but also him. China doesn't really care who leads the Russian economy, the Russian state, as long as it gets what it needs. And the more dependency Russia has put on China as its backer to keep its war economy afloat, Putin has very little option. That said, there is a paradox. The same operation that rattles the Kremlin may also tempt it into dangerous conclusions, and it's where it gets more complicated. Because while the lightning raid in Caracas has clearly caused unease in Moscow and in Beijing, that unease may not run as deep or in the direction many assume. Certainly, no autocrat enjoys watching one of their own seized, shackled and conditioned, their fate left to a foreign court. For men like Putin, those moments cut very close to the bone, Maduro's being a lighter version of Putin's own system. For example, a little-known tidbit, Putin was reportedly so disturbed by the lynching of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, apparently imagining that the same fate could fall him, that he watched the exact video footage of Gaddafi's killing on loop. It's not hard to imagine the Russian leader, already indicted by the ICC, although one questions the relevance of the UN these days, feeling a similar chill watching Maduro's downfall. What would happen to Putin if he actually got apprehended? But of course, fear doesn't translate automatically into confrontation. Inside Moscow, and by extension Beijing, there will also be a very different reading taking shape. One that says this operation reveals less about American strength globally than America's willingness to bully regionally. In this view, Trump isn't demonstrating a renewed appetite for, say, global leadership. He's demonstrating comfort-picking fights with the weaker opponents, a backyard bully rather than a centre stage enforcer, if you like. So far, Trump has shown a pattern. Assertive, spectacular, but contained uses of force. Narrow airstrikes on the ISIS affiliates in Nigeria, limited strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. A dramatic but brief operation against Iran's nuclear program. Each of these delivers a clear, television-friendly moment of dominance, something that plays very well with Trump's own domestic base. Now, the siege of Maduro fits that pattern pretty well. It gratifies US right and sends a chilling message to any South American leader attempting to step out of line. But it is still primarily in the Western Hemisphere, and where it is, well, demonstrates where the United States is focused. Indeed, zoom further out, and the less impressive it may look. From Moscow's perspective, this doesn't necessarily signal a US ready to stand up for strong adversaries. Trump has shown far less appetite to confront Russia over Ukraine and has openly raised fears he could abandon Taiwan in pursuit of a grand bargain with China, sort of cutting up the world into spheres of influence. That interpretation was enforced earlier in December when the Trump administration published its national security strategy, of which I've made an in-depth look at, and this idea of explicit transactionalism. So, if Russian Chinese leaders conclude that the seizure of Maduro is part of a broader US retreat from global responsibility in favour of regional hegemony, they may feel emboldened rather than deterred. And so it's this ambiguity about where the real danger lies. In any such scenario, Venezuela isn't a warning shot. It's confirmation that the world is moving towards these negotiated zones of control. The US dominates its Western Hemisphere, Russia asserts its post-Soviet space, and China pressures its own Southeast Asian or broader Indo-Pacific neighbours. So from there, the logic becomes brutally transactional and a case of regionalisation or just realpolitik. A US-aligned Venezuela in exchange for Ukraine, ending on Russia terms, not of course peace, but transactionality, and perhaps something that Putin may be okay with. Now, that being said, all of that, on the surface it sounds like absolute resolve hands Moscow something useful. It weakens one of Russia's rivals in Americas, it muddles moral distinctions, and it reinforces a world of transactionality as long as the Russian government plays its cards right and, well, in some ways even falls into line with the United States. But scratch beneath that surface and everything effect is an opposite, because this operation isn't about legitimizing power politics. It demonstrates how brutally exposed leaders of a certain type can become when they lose the momentum, the loyalty, or relevance. And for Putin, as always, for his survivability, that's the real takeaway. Watching Maduro flown off to fight foreign injustice isn't reassuring, even if the strategic logic looks favourable on paper. It reinforces the most dangerous fear inside the Kremlin, that strength is conditional, allies are expendable, and exits are never negotiated, especially by strong men or great powers. They're imposed. So Russian strategists can talk themselves into seeing opportunity. the psychological impact runs the other way. This doesn't make Putin bolder, it makes him more suspicious, more paranoid, and more inclined to clamp down at home, which ultimately could also lead to his downfall. Moscow isn't therefore just calculating, it is panicking, albeit quietly, and watching to see not just what, but who might be next. But that's it from me. Thanks very much for watching, everyone. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Give the video a like and do subscribe if you want more insider analysis like that. You can find links in the description to support me further or join me on Substack for deeper dives or the Clips channel. Take care. See you soon.